If you're teaching algebra, it is not necessarily obvious that you will end up in a conversation about structural racism or interpersonal racism or other such things. Whereas the material I teach, for better or for worse, is constantly talking about this. Just an ongoing conversation all the time. In fact, it's deeply related. It's something that you need to think about, but people don't necessarily know that.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Kasia Bartoszynska joins us for a wide-ranging chat about her comparative literature studies, anti-racism work, translations, and more.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we are excited to speak with Dr. Kasia Bartoszynska. Kasia is an associate professor at Ithaca College in literatures in English and in women's, gender, and sexuality studies.
She is a reader, writer, educator, translator, and lover of good food. And we will talk about translation, anti-racism, and her recent book titled Estranging the Novel. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Kasia.
Thank you so much.
So, Kasia, we always like to start our podcast by asking our guest about their background and path with languages and learning languages. What does that look like for you?
Oh, sure. My first language is Polish. We moved to the U.S. when I was about 3 years old. So then I learned English. And then, I guess I'll give you the full story since it seems appropriate. Because it also relates, I think, to my translation work, because I spoke English at home a lot because, as a kid, because my parents also wanted to learn English. So we were all kind of practicing our English together. And then, as is often the case, like my Polish kind of receded increasingly. Sure. And we would come back to visit family and they would sort of poke fun at me because in Polish, I would have an accent or it wasn't so good. But then it really came back. I mean, as I got older, I kind of really committed to it. And I started writing letters back and forth with my grandmother, because this was before the age of ready email access. And then I guess meanwhile, I started taking French in junior high school. And then my first year of high school in ninth grade, we lived in Berlin for a year. My dad had a fellowship and we moved to Germany. So I started studying German intensively. I went to a German American high school. So I had lots and lots of German language lessons, but also in the way of bizarre high school plans, my math class was in German and my PE class was in German. So I had this kind of immersion experience. So I learned quite a lot of German that year. But I also went at night to a Polish high school.
Oh, wow.
And so that was also a kind of shock to the system because it meant that, what I was used to speaking familial kind of intimate language at home, suddenly I had to speak formal school Polish and write essays in Polish, which was a nightmare. And so then that was a kind of intensive year of language learning in different ways.
Yeah.
Then we came back to the States after a year. I continued learning French, but I also continued learning German because I had this great base. So then when I got to college, I continued studying French, but mostly quit and did more and more German. And also I had a great college professor who insisted that I could not be an English major because I knew too many languages. So he didn't to do comparative literature instead. So I started reading more in Polish and kind of working in studying literature in Polish as well, and did some summer courses in Poland and stuff like that. So when I went to graduate school, I was I still had some French. I had some German. I was initially going to do German and Polish, and then very quickly I decided that I wasn't going to do German. I got interested in Irish literature, which sort of ended up being my book project. But also, on the off chance that I might be trying to get a job in a Slavics department, I had to start learning Russian. So I took Russian for a few years and learned some Russian. And then, as a kind of icing on the cake, my first academic job out of graduate school was in Turkey. So I started intensively studying Turkish.
Wow.
And I lived in Turkey for 3 years, and got to be decent at the language, not an expert by any means. But so that's sort of my very strange background in languages. I'm at like 845 days of Duolingo Spanish too.
Oh, look at that. Nice. Wow.
I feel really stupid about it, but a friend of mine had posted her, like 100-day milestone on Duolingo, and I was like, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna do this. And now I feel like I actually can understand some Spanish, which is exciting.
That's awesome. And that is quite the varied experience with languages. That's what we like to hear here on Speaking of Language. So Kasia, your personal website is titled Kasia Reads, The Things I Read and Write About. Excellent title, we approve.
Thank you.
And the things that you read and write about are actually quite varied. So let's start by talking about one of your more recent projects. You are looking into free indirect discourse, which coincidentally in German is known as erlebte Rede, and how that works or is theorized in different languages. Yes. Tell us more about this. What is free indirect discourse and what are you looking at?
Yeah, so, well, first, just to define it, free indirect discourse is a moment in a novel when the narrator, when you have like a third person narrator, so a narrator saying like, he or she did this, went down the street, like describing the characters from the outside. Free indirect discourse is a moment when the narrator's speech gets sort of inflected by the characters. So the narrator is describing a scene, but using words that the character might use. And some people say this is like a moment where the narrator dips into the character's thoughts. Some people say this is a moment when the character like takes over the speech from the narrator. Some people say this is when the two voices speak as one. It's tricky to define. It's tricky to identify also because there's no explicit marker. It's not like it appears in quotes or something.
Sure.
So you have to just sort of recognize that like, oh, this isn't a thing the narrator would say. This doesn't, or wow, this really sounds like something the character would say. Sometimes it's very obvious because it is like a sort of intrusive thought of the characters that jumps into the text. But otherwise, yeah, it can be much more subtle. And I'm really interested in it because the more you study it, the more you realize that we don't really have a good sense of what it is and what it does. It's widely agreed to be very, very important. Everyone's like, yes, this is one theorist, Francis Ferguson, said it is like the novel's one formal contribution to literature. It's like, people will say it's the most important kind of formal technique invented in the 19th century, although it actually starts much earlier. But it's not, there's not a kind of clear consensus about what it is and what it does. Unlike many, ideas in literary theory or narrative theory, there's no one text that everybody goes to define it or explain it. Like if you've ever studied it in a class, it's not like everyone goes to the same reading or the same examples. Most of the time, people are kind of improvising definitions in class. And so I'm really fascinated in how it works.
Right.
Often it works at its best when it's the most subtle, when you almost don't notice what's happening. So I just read this fantastic novel by Katie Kitamura called The Long Shot, which has two main characters, and a narrator who's speaking from the outside, but the perspective jumps between the two characters and you almost don't know when it's happening. Like if you flip back to an earlier page in the novel and are like, wait, so who was this? Who was looking at this scene? You sometimes can't even tell. And similarly, when you're reading, there'll be these words where you're like, wait, that's an odd word for the narrator to use. Or that's unexpected, right? So yeah, I think it's a really fascinating technique. We also don't have a clear sense of where it began, how it developed. For a long time, people would say that Jane Austen invented it. Jane Austen certainly was a kind of crucial force for popularizing it and using it in really cool and complicated ways. But it definitely appears before Jane Austen. If you talk to like medievalists, they'll say, oh yeah, it's all over the place. And similarly, also, we think of it as a technique that is specific to fiction, but you also find it in sermons or letters or journal articles. Anytime someone is reporting something that someone else said, it may appear, right, because it's a narrator sort of borrowing speech from someone else. Yeah.
Have you noticed any drastic differences or anything that stands out to you when you look at writing in different languages?
So one thing that I would like to understand better, but unfortunately I don't have enough language skills to really do this properly, is to think about how it works in different languages. So for example, in Japanese, there's a question of how, how to put this. In Japanese, there's an idea of a specific grammatical kind of technique that happens, which is the use of a particular kind of verb that would accomplish the same effect, but it's not quite the same thing, right? It's like when a narrator uses this verb form that would only be used in these other contexts, then that triggers something. There's an article that tries to describe what this might be like in Japanese by a theorist who describes what he calls the non-reportive style. It's not exactly the same thing, but it may accomplish a similar effect. And so there's a real question of whether, because of the way subjects and objects work, or person and speakers or things like that, there's a real question of like how this could possibly function. Like I can imagine that in Polish, where all nouns are gendered, if you have a clear male narrator, you could potentially do something by using female gendered nouns. I don't know if anyone has actually done that, but it would be, that's one way it could happen in Polish where it could not happen in English.
Fascinating.
So yeah, this is what I want to like reach out to all the linguists I know and start asking them to find
absolutely. Yeah, very cool.
Lab and research assistants and
Excellent. Well, let's shift gears a little bit because we've got a lot. You do a lot of things, and I would like to try to get a little sampling of whatever we can in our time here. I know that a few years ago you worked on anti-racism efforts and co-facilitated the Antiracism Institute at Ithaca College. So what did your work as a Dana teaching fellow there entail?
Yeah, so I did that for 2 years, and basically the Antiracism Institute was like a voluntary, sort of project where faculty and staff could sign up for basically like weekly meetings where we would read texts and talk about experiences we'd had and really try to understand like how structural racism manifests at the college, both in the classroom, but also not only in the classroom, right? And so it was sort of a space, not exactly a class as like a reading group almost, and discussion group, I would say. Something that I immediately realized, and in doing these kinds of workshops, because in addition to leading this, or rather I should say co-facilitating, so in addition to co-facilitating the group, I would also go to occasional workshops or lectures that served as resources to learn about like decolonizing the classroom, or I'm a little skeptical of that term. I think, as many people are at this point. Right. But something that comes up for me every time, like there was a recent one, it was called like how to have difficult conversations in class. And I was like, great, like I want to like teach me how to have difficult conversations in class. I want to do it. And what I realized is that many people in the classes they teach, like those topics don't come up naturally, right? Like it's not like if you're teaching algebra, it is not necessarily obvious that you will end up in a conversation about structural racism or interpersonal racism or other such things. Whereas the material I teach, for better or for worse, is constantly talking about this. I mean, just an ongoing conversation all the time, right? Like in my introduction to women's and gender studies class, we talk about sexism and patriarchy, and I'm like, well, we have to think about that alongside structural racism because these two systems overlap all the time, right? You know, one of my students once was like, well, I just like, women have never oppressed men, like men always oppress women. And I was like, well, a lot of white women have in fact oppressed plenty of men. And she was just like, oh, wow. Like, I mean, light bulbs were going off.
Yeah.
Great learning moment. But it is, again, in a way, we all know this, like intersectionality, it's important to kind of think about all these systems in relation to each other. But the point is just that, yeah, I mean, these conversations come up all the time in my classes just by virtue of the material I teach. So, for many people, it's a question of like, how do I even start to have those conversations, or what are ways I can bring this in? Where I'm like, no, like it's all here already. Which in some ways makes it easier, right? Because there is a natural opening and a kind of obvious need to have those conversations. Where I think the difficulty for many people is that it can feel sort of extraneous or unnecessary or gratuitous. Like, oh, why are we talking about this thing that isn't actually related to learning about physical therapy, right? And my college physical therapy is like, in fact, it's deeply related and very much part of the work physical therapists do, and something that you need to think about, but people don't necessarily know that.
Right. Yeah, fascinating.
I also, actually, one thing I would also add to that is that I think in anti-racism efforts at universities, there's a ton of focus on what goes on in the classroom, rightfully so. I mean, that's a big part of what happens, probably in some sense the main thing that happens. But there are also so many other interactions, right? So, like last year, in the anti-racism workshop, most of the people participating were staff. Right? They were getting a little frustrated at times about the ways that faculty were always like, well, in the classroom, this is happening. And they're like, okay, but we're not in the classroom and we still encounter this stuff all the time. So talk about that and think about how that works. And so I think it's important to remember that, colleges and universities are these sort of like, there's a lot going on here that isn't just the classroom space. And in some ways, an especially challenging one is like interactions students have with each other on campus outside classes, and like how to help them navigate that, right? And and recognize, if they see, I mean, even on a basis, like if they see somebody saying something, horrifically racist and awful, like what should they do in that moment? But also a lot of subtler forms of interaction, right? Like, So.
This, I mean, any community where you have people showing up from their own different geographic and economic and cultural point of origin, and all being forced together for the first time.
I mean, I had this realization a while ago, and I think this is true. I'm still like, I'm totally prepared to be wrong about this, but I have this hunch that in some ways, college may be the most diverse environment that a person is likely to be in. And I mean, obviously, it's already a very privileged sort of minority of people who actually go to college, which, as we know, is not, representative of the larger population. But nonetheless, within that college, you are going to get like a broad variety of sort of geographic origins, a fair amount of socioeconomic difference, different religions, racial difference. So, I mean, some schools more so than others, obviously, but I think, even your sort of run-of-the-mill college still is a place where you are more likely to meet different people who are different in all kinds of ways. And I try to tell my students this of like, seize this opportunity. I mean, the older you get, the more your social circles tend to kind of narrow. You start hanging out with people who are your same socioeconomic class, who share your political views, who probably have the same job as you, and your perspective on the world shrinks. So.
Yeah. Interesting. So completely shifting gears once again here. Your book titled Estranging the Novel, Poland, Ireland, and Theories of World Literature won the Donald Murphy Prize for Distinguished First Books in Irish Studies in 2022. This is where we need to cue the applause. Woohoo!
Yay, thank you.
So this prize is awarded by the American Conference for Irish Studies for the best first book written on Irish literatures and cultures. What got you interested in the intersection of Poland and Ireland, and how does one estrange novels?
Like, wow, the whole description of the whole prize. Although I will also say, since you mentioned it, it did also win a prize in Polish studies as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's just kind of funny. I mean, I am proud of it because being a comparative Polish and Irish book, it feels sort of validating that
absolutely,
recognized it. But the Polish prize is the Wacław Lednicki Award. It's kind of a corny story, but it is nonetheless true. I think I was in high school or maybe college. And my grandmother went on a trip to Ireland, and when she got back, she said, "They're just like us." It really was the sort of origin story of like, wow. But then I took an Irish literature class my first semester, I think, of graduate school, partly because I got to graduate school and was like, oh, what do I do? What classes do I take? And I took this Irish literature class and fell in love with the sort of, the literary tradition overall. But the thing I was especially fascinated by was that there would be this kind of regular refrain of like, this novel is unique. It doesn't fit into the kind of literary tradition. It's this sort of anomalous, weird case, but it's very particularly Irish. And for every one of those novels, I could think of a Polish counterpart that similarly seemed exceptional and anomalous and strange. So my book is actually a series of pairs of these weird novels that are weirdly similar to each other.
Oh, very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I will say, I don't recommend it as a way to structure a book. Because if you want to add another chapter, it's like, well, you got to find the pair, So that was very frustrating. But there were enough to sustain one book, at least.
Awesome. That won not one, but two prizes.
I know. This is I'm loving the whole, the duality of the whole thing. You have also worked as a translator of Polish to English, particularly of the works of sociologist and philosopher Zygmunt Bauman. How does translation fit into the rest of your work? Is there a particular approach or philosophy to translation that you can share with us?
Yeah. In a way, I'm tempted to say that I've kind of been translating informally my whole life.
Sure.
Just interactions with family, many members of my family speak English, but some don't. And so conversations and things like that. But then also my grandmother is a sociologist. So when I was in high school, I think at some point she would be like, hey, can you just check the grammar and make sure everything is okay? And my parents are mathematicians, but they would similarly be like, wait, can you look over this thing I've written? And then that gradually sort of expanded into like, oh, maybe you could translate this, brief thing for a friend of mine or something. So I was doing it informally for a while. And then I think I had done a series of sociology articles first, but then I was asked if I was interested in doing this book of conversations between Zygmunt Bauman and Stanisław Obirek. And so yeah, sure, why not? That sounds fun.
Nice.
And then I did one, and then was like, do you want to do another one? Do you want to do another one?
Isn't that how it goes?
At the time, yeah, as these things go. And at the time, he was still alive. And so it was nice to have a kind of relationship with the person whose work you're
sure, yeah.
Especially because he wrote most of his stuff in English. I mean, he was fluent in English, and he had a very particular English style of his own. So, he probably could have translated all of these things on his own, but he was also very busy and doing a lot of reading and writing. I mean, he was an astonishingly prolific writer, especially in the later years of his life. But so it meant that all of my work, he could kind of check, and he could check in a very authoritative way. And so it was very helpful for him to say, like, yes, this is good, I'm happy with it, and to feel like that meant something.
Sure.
Which was all the more important because then when he passed away, I had more of these books to do and was like, there's no one to check my work anymore. I've studied translation a little bit. And obviously I've read a lot of works in translation. Oh, well, I guess I should mention also, I was, for 2 years, I was a judge of the Best Translated Book Award, or one of the judges. I was on the panel of judges for the Best Translated Book Award, which happened actually because, in the days of in Twitter's glory days, they were tweeting about the award, and I, on a whim, sent a message like, "Do you need any judges for that? I would love to." Yes, please. And I just want to put this out. If anyone needs book prizes judged, like, I love because what happens is that then, I mean, at least for this prize, every single work of fiction in translation was sent to my house. I mean,
wow.
700 books.
Oh my God.
And so, of course, as judges, like, we divided them up, and, so everyone was responsible for reading their share, but then anyone that was especially good, you would tell everyone else to read. And,
yeah.
But it meant that I read a ton of literature and translation, and sort of in a very concentrated way, where with languages where I didn't know the original. And people would say all the time, like, how can you tell if it's a good translation? And yeah, I mean, I can't tell if it is directly faithful to the original, right? I don't have that knowledge, but I can tell how it reads in the,
sure.
in English. Does it have a sense of a particular voice? Does it seem awkward? Does it seem, something that I struggle with as a translator is that I kind of like when language is a little bit awkward or a little bit straight. Like, I like that slightly, how would I put it? Like, slightly disjointed feeling of a translation sometimes, because I think in a way that's what innovates English, right? I mean, realizing that, you can put these words in a different order, shaking you out of your normal habits of language. So in that sense, I like translations that are a little bit off, but at the same time, so I wrote an article, an essay, I guess a couple years ago now, but about Olga Tokarczuk's novels, and about Books of Jacob in particular. And at the time, Jennifer Croft's translation hadn't come out yet. So all of the quotes in the essay I translated myself. And then a year later, her translation came out, so I could compare them side by side, and I was like, oh no. Those are so good. They're so beautiful and just, I mean, they flow, and mine seem like weirdly, I mean, awkward, but like not in a good way in comparison.
Well, that's something we talked about that a lot when we had Caroline Levine on the podcast last semester, who is the one who recommended we reach out to you. Just there's translation as far as meaning goes, but there's also character and the way to navigate the balance of the two of them leads to these wildly different and differently effective translations. So that's certainly one of the interesting things.
This is why, in part, so pretty much all of my translation, there are very, very few, very small exceptions, but pretty much all of my translation has been academic. And I would never say that academic writing doesn't have style. It absolutely does.
Sure.
And yet it feels less kind of intimidating or overwhelming to capture than the style of a literary work, which I guess in part because literary works have so many different voices and they're doing so many kind of very intentional artistic things with language. Where again, you know, academic writing may also be beautiful. It may be doing complex things with language, but it still feels somehow easier. I've been working on a novel translation for a while, as in my copious free time, and it's really hard. It's really, really hard to do. And so it's sort of like a thing that I work on when I want like a really tough puzzle to kind of bang my head against a wall for a while. Whereas academic writing, I think somehow just feels easier. And like my method is that the first pass is just that I sort of read it and type in English like in one go, you know.
Yeah.
Then I'll go back over it and start, you know, looking at specific words and start kind of really wrestling with it. But the first pass often feels very easy and sort of instinctive.
Yeah. Well, Kasia, we could keep asking all sorts of other questions. There is just so much that you are doing, so many various fascinating projects. Where can our listeners find out more about you and the work that you do and all your various dabblings and all the things?
My website is probably the best place. It's Kasia Reads, so KasiaReads.com. And I keep a blog there of the novels, or not only novels, I guess. I keep a blog there of all of the things that I'm reading, which is sometimes very short posts, sometimes longer ones. But and then on the website overall, I also post links to various things I've published or things I'm working on.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Beautiful. Well, this has been wonderful getting to chat with you. Before we sign off, please share a word with us in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, that feels good to say. What's that word for you?
So I was thinking about this a lot when you sent it to me before. And as a preamble, I will say that I took a course at the University of Chicago when I was in graduate school. I had to take a course on how to teach Slavic languages, which was amazing and really helpful for my work as a translator also, because on the one hand, you learn so much about a language when you have to teach it to someone else, but also then the kind of meta level of learning how to teach it, right? And one of the things that the instructor, Stephen Clancy, had us do was to get a textbook for a language that we didn't know at all and had no connection to, and try to teach ourselves the language on our own.
Oh, cool.
Learning exercise. And it was amazing. Because what you realize very quickly is that it's incredibly difficult to do. But the reason I bring this up is because he talked about how one of the kind of markers of fluency or ability, I think they're called islands, which is a word that native speakers use when they don't know what to say, like sort of to fill gaps. And those words are different in every language, right? So a speaker in English might say, or so like, things like that. And he said, this is the sign of the native speaker, is that they know those words. And the non-native speaker just kind of sits there in a silent panic, like, what do we do?
Yes, I know it well.
So you have to give people those words so that they can have a thing to say when they're stuck. Right. So in Turkish, my word was şey, which is like thing. But it is a word that Turkish speakers will be like, şey, like this thing. So that was like my nice life preserver that I hold on to when trying to make my way through conversations with Turkish speakers.
That's awesome. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, this was lovely. It was so interesting speaking with you. Thank you for sharing all of your different perspectives and projects. And thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Kasia.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Next week, we will hear from our most recent LRC Speaker Series presenter, Dr. Ilka Kostka, who gave a talk about generative AI in language education and insights and implications for teacher development.
You can watch her talk on our website, and then you'll be extra prepared to catch her podcast episode next week.
Until then,
auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.